My parents sued me after cutting me out of their lives 20 years ago. The day I stepped into that courtroom in Santa Fe felt nothing like justice. It felt like betrayal dressed in formal clothes. Cameras flashed outside the courthouse doors while reporters shouted questions I had no interest in answering. The one that stuck in my head came from a woman with a notepad and sharp eyes. She asked if it was true my parents had disowned me. I looked at her for half a second before walking away. Let them print whatever sells. Inside the courtroom, the air was thick enough to choke on. My father, Robert Cole, sat beside my mother, Linda, at the plaintiff's table. He used to be 6'4" and built like a mountain when he played college basketball. Now he just looked like a man who'd lost more than games. His once sharp suit hung loose, his hair more gray than black. My mother, always the picture of control, had that same blank face she used when she used to report the evening news. She wouldn't even look at me. I hadn't seen either of them in over 2 decades. I'd been hoping to keep it that way. The clerk called the case, and I rose from my seat. My palms were steady, but my stomach turned like wet gravel. I'd stood in court 1,000 times before as a prosecutor for the state of New Mexico, but never like this. Never with the 2 people who'd brought me into this world sitting across the aisle, trying to strip me of what my grandfather left me. I caught my reflection in the polished surface of the defense table. I looked like a stranger wearing my own face. The judge entered, and everyone stood. Judge Marcus Graves, mid-50s, silver streaks in his hair, eyes that missed nothing. He had that kind of stillness that made noise feel disrespectful. When he sat, the whole room seemed to hold its breath. Mr. Torres, my parents' attorney, rose first. I recognized him. He had been one of my grandfather's former students at the University of New Mexico School of Law. Slick suit, perfect smile, eyes that liked sharp corners. He started speaking in that calm, poisonous tone lawyers use when they know they've got an audience. He said that I had manipulated my elderly grandfather, that I had used his fragile state to rewrite his will in my favor. I kept my face still. I'd learned long ago that in court, emotion is ammunition for the wrong side. When he sat down, it was my turn. I stood, buttoned my jacket, and said the only thing that mattered. Your Honor, all I did was respect my grandfather's wishes. He was clear, coherent, and perfectly aware of what he was doing. There was no manipulation, just truth. My voice came out calmer than I expected. Even to me, the judge flipped through a few papers, his brow tightening. Then his gaze lifted and landed on me. For a few seconds, he just studied my face like he was chasing a memory. Mr. Cole, he said slowly. Are you related to the late Judge Samuel Cole? I nodded once. He was my grandfather. Zir. Graves leaned back slightly, his expression shifting into something softer. I knew your grandfather, he said quietly. We served together back in Albuquerque. A fine man, one of the last who believed justice had a heartbeat. My father's lawyer shifted uncomfortably. My mother's head jerked up, confusion flashing in her blue eyes. The courtroom fell so silent I could hear the hum of the ceiling lights. Graves glanced down at the file again, almost smiling, then said, Proceed. His tone carried a weight none of them caught, but I did. For the first time since this nightmare started, I felt a small spark of control. As the hearing moved forward, I caught my father watching me. There was no warmth there, just something sour, like resentment that had aged too long. He whispered something to my mother, and she nodded, her jaw tightening. Maybe they were remembering the kid they left on my grandfather's porch with a bag of baby clothes and a half-hearted promise to come back. They never did. When recess was called, I stepped outside for air. The courthouse steps burned in the noon sun. Reporters swarmed again, their questions slicing through the heat. A woman from Santa Fe Chronicle shoved a recorder toward me. Is it true, Mr. Cole, that your parents disowned you at 18? I stopped for a moment, met her eyes, and said, They didn't just cut me off. They erased me. Then I walked away. I lit a cigarette even though I'd quit years ago. Some habits crawl back when your past does too. Across the street, people were already gossiping. A prosecutor sued by his own parents. It made for good headlines. My phone buzzed nonstop. Missed calls from colleagues. Messages from friends asking what the hell was happening. I ignored them all. Inside my head, I could still hear my grandfather's voice. Justice isn't about comfort, Ethan. It's about conscience. He used to say that when I was a kid, sitting beside him at that old wooden table on the ranch, my feet not even touching the floor. Now, standing outside the courthouse, I realized how right he'd been. Justice wasn't comfortable. It was lonely as hell. I flicked the cigarette to the curb and walked back inside. The security guard nodded at me. I'd seen him before. Years back. During another trial. He gave me a look that said, "I'm sorry, man." I nodded back. No words needed. When I took my seat again, Torres leaned toward my parents, whispering something. My mother's lips twitched into the faintest smile. It wasn't victory. It was arrogance. My father crossed his arms, staring straight ahead like he was the victim here. They looked united. Finally. After 20 years apart, united against me, Judge Graves returned. His expression unreadable. "Let's continue," he said. His eyes found mine once more. And this time, I could tell he remembered more than he'd said aloud. That recognition in his gaze, it wasn't casual. It was history. I straightened my papers, ready for whatever came next. I didn't know yet how deep this fight would cut, or how far the truth would have to stretch before it found daylight. All I knew was that the man who taught me justice once shared a bench with the man now holding the gavel, and in that silence before the next witness was called, I could almost hear my grandfather whispering through memory, "Steady as ever. Do the right thing, no matter who's watching." Then the bailiff's voice broke through, announcing the next testimony, and the trial moved on. The courtroom faded in my mind, replaced by the faint sound of the wind pushing through pine trees. Whenever things got too heavy, that's where my mind went. Back to Cole Ranch. The only place that ever felt like home. I was 6 the first time I realized my parents weren't coming back. I'd been living with my grandfather, Judge Samuel Cole, for as long as I could remember. The house sat a few miles outside Santa Fe, built from sun-worn wood and stubborn love. He used to say the land taught patience better than any courtroom. Every morning, the sky turned orange over the desert, and the smell of coffee drifted from the kitchen, where he read case files even after retirement. He wasn't a soft man, but he was fair, the kind who spoke little but never broke a promise. When I messed up, he didn't yell, just looked at me long enough for guilt to do its job. He called that the quiet kind of justice. My earliest memory of my parents was them standing by that front gate, suitcases in the back of a black sedan. My mother crouched, adjusted my jacket, told me to be good for Grandpa. My father ruffled my hair like a stranger would a neighbor's kid, not his own. They said they'd be back in a week. Weeks turned into years. I didn't understand it then. I just kept asking when they'd return. Grandpa never lied to me. He said he didn't know. He said sometimes people lose their way, and some never find it again. One night when I was around 7, I couldn't sleep. The wind outside howled against the windows, and the house creaked like an old ship. I wandered to the living room. He was there, sitting under the soft light of a lamp, a book open in his lap. I sat across from him, holding one of his chess pieces, a white knight with the paint worn off. "Why did they leave me, Grandpa?" I asked. He didn't answer right away. He closed the book, took off his glasses, and stared into the dark window where our reflections floated. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but steady. "Some people live for themselves, Ethan. They chase freedom, comfort, attention. But others live for something greater than themselves. They choose responsibility, truth, love. Your parents chose themselves. I chose you. It hurt. But it also made sense in a way I could live with. I wasn't abandoned. I was chosen. Life on the ranch was simple but not easy. I learned how to fix fences, how to drive the old pickup that barely made it up the hill, how to feed the horses before school. Grandpa made sure I learned everything twice. Once with my hands, once with my heart. At night, we'd sit by the fireplace and play chess. He'd always let me start, but never let me win. When I got frustrated, he'd lean back and say, "Patience, Ethan. You can't force a win. Justice works the same way. You wait. You think. You act right when the time comes. He kept a small leather-bound diary on the desk in his study. Sometimes I'd catch him writing in it after dinner. His handwriting neat, deliberate. I once asked what he wrote. He smiled. Said it was where he left things he didn't want the world to forget. Years later, when I was 15, that diary was still there. But Grandpa looked older. His shoulders slumped more. His breath came shorter after a day of tending to the garden. I started to realize he wasn't invincible. He caught me staring once and said, "Don't worry about time, Ethan. Just make sure when it runs out, you've spent it right." On my 18th birthday, I got a letter in the mail. The return address was Los Angeles. The handwriting was my father's. I hadn't heard from them since I was a kid. Inside was a single page, folded twice. It wasn't a birthday card. It was a legal notice. They'd officially removed me from the family records. It said that I was no longer their dependent or heir, that they had no further obligation to me. I sat at the kitchen table holding that letter, my hands shaking. Grandpa came in, saw my face, took the paper without asking. He read it slowly, jaw tight. When he finished, he folded it once and tossed it into the fire. "They didn't cut you off," he said. "They just freed you to build your own name." I didn't speak for a long time. Watching the paper curl and turn to ash, I felt something close to relief. That night, I made a quiet promise to never need them again. The following years blurred into long days of study and work. Grandpa's health faded, but his mind never did. He'd sit by the window, reading old court opinions, still arguing with the pages. Sometimes he'd test me, ask how I'd rule if I were on the bench. I'd answer, and he'd shake his head. "Think again. Always think twice before deciding what's fair." He taught me to respect the law, but not worship it. He said law without humanity was just another kind of cruelty. There were nights when the desert got so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat. I'd lie awake wondering if my parents ever thought about me. I imagined them somewhere far away, successful, maybe even proud of what I'd become. But deep down, I knew pride wasn't in their nature. When I was 20, I applied to law school at the University of New Mexico. Grandpa insisted I could do better, maybe Harvard, but I told him I wanted to stay close. He laughed, said I was stubborn in all the right ways. The day I left for Albuquerque, he handed me that same old diary. It was empty on the last few pages. "You might need this someday," he said. "There's wisdom in seeing what came before you." I kept it safe through law school, through internships, through every sleepless night I spent reading case law under dim lights. Every time I felt like giving up, I'd think of him sitting on that porch, watching the sun climb over the ranch. A man who never bent even when life tried to break him. Years later, when he started to cough more often and eat less, I knew what it meant. Though neither of us said it out loud, I took over more chores, handled the bills, drove him to appointments. He hated hospitals, said they smelled like surrender. One evening, he asked me to bring his diary. I handed it to him, and he opened it to a blank page. "Write something for me," he said. I asked what. "Anything that matters to you right now." I thought for a minute, then wrote a single line. "Truth survives even when men don't." He smiled, closed the book, and said, "That's my boy." When he passed a few years later, that sentence was still there. I didn't know then how much weight it would carry, or how far that truth would follow me. The wind outside the courthouse in Santa Fe felt just like the wind that used to sweep across the ranch. I could almost smell the dry earth and pine, hear the creak of the screen door, and see him standing there, watching me the way he used to before I left for school. I straightened my jacket, took a slow breath, and walked back into the courtroom. The afternoon light hit the side of the courthouse windows, and for a moment I saw my reflection. Older, harder, but still that same kid from the ranch trying to hold it together. My grandfather had been gone for 4 years when they showed up again. I remember that day like a wound that never quite healed. It was late summer in Santa Fe. Liangtianling Ishiwu. I had just finished law school and was working my first job at a small legal office downtown. The ranch had grown quiet without Grandpa's voice echoing through the halls. I'd kept everything the same, even his old chessboard sitting on the table by the window. That afternoon, I was fixing a loose fence post when I heard tires crunching on the gravel road. I looked up, expecting the mail truck. But what I saw froze me. A silver SUV pulled up, and out stepped Robert and Linda Cole. My father wore a navy suit, his once broad shoulders narrower than I remembered. My mother stood beside him in sunglasses. Hair perfect. Smile practiced. For a few seconds I thought I was hallucinating. I wiped the sweat from my forehead, set the hammer down, and waited for the punchline that never came. They walked toward me like they belonged there. "Ethan," my mother said, her voice lighter than it had any right to be. "You've grown." I stared at her, not sure what to say. It had been 20 years. The last time she'd spoken my name, I was a teenager reading a letter that said I no longer existed to them. Now she was standing in front of me like nothing had happened. My father glanced around the property, hands on his hips, still standing. Huh. He looked at the barn, the porch, the hills stretching out behind the house. Same old place. Grandpa's kingdom. I wanted to tell him to leave, to take his expensive car and his fake concern somewhere else. But the words stuck. Instead, I asked why they were there. Linda answered before he could. "We came to make peace." She said it like it was a favor. I told them Grandpa wasn't home anymore. They both froze. My father frowned. "What do you mean? Not home? He's in town or something." I looked him dead in the eye and said, "He's gone. Has been for months." The silence that followed was heavy. My mother's face fell for half a second before she caught herself. Robert sighed, shook his head, muttered something like, "Damn it." They stayed anyway. I didn't invite them in, but they walked past me toward the house. Inside, my mother drifted through the living room, running her fingers along the shelves. Same curtains, same smell, she said softly. My father sat down at the table like it was still his. We talked, or tried to. Most of it felt rehearsed. He told me he'd made some bad business moves, lost a few deals, that the market turned on him. My mother said they were living in Los Angeles but considering moving back to New Mexico. I waited for the part that mattered. It came soon enough. Dad leaned forward, clasped his hands. "The house. The land. It's still under Dad's name." "Right." I nodded. "We thought maybe." He hesitated. "Maybe we could work something out." I blinked. "Work what out?" He smiled the same way he used to before lying. "Maybe we could sell part of it. Just for now. We're going through a tough stretch." That was the moment I realized they weren't there for peace. They were there for money. I told him no. Flat. Without a second thought. "The ranch stays as it is. Grandpa wanted it that way." He leaned back, eyes narrowing. "You think you know what he wanted better than I do." I looked at him. Really looked. And saw a man who couldn't stand that someone else had inherited the one thing he thought he deserved. My mother put a hand on his arm, trying to smooth things over. But he jerked away. "You always thought you were better than me, didn't you?" His voice rose, and the air in the room seemed to shift. "You think a law degree makes you smarter? A damn hero. You don't know what it's like to have everything taken from you," I said, quietly. "You gave it away yourself." That was enough to set him off. He stood, towering over me like he used to when I was a kid. He slammed his hand against the table. "You don't talk to me like that. I'm your father." I stood up too. "You were. Once." The words came out sharper than I planned. Grandpa's voice from memory echoed in my head. "Never fight anger with anger, Ethan." But it was too late for calm. My father's face turned red. "You think that old man was a saint. He ruined this family. He turned you against us." He paused, breathing hard. "You'll see. You'll regret this." He stormed toward the door. My mother followed. But before stepping out, she turned to me. "You could have handled that better," she said softly. "Maybe he wouldn't have if you'd just listened." When the door closed behind them, the house fell silent again. The sound of the wind filled the gaps they left. I sank into the chair my father had just used and stared at the chessboard. The white knight lay on its side. I set it upright, the way Grandpa always did after a loss. That night I found myself sitting on the porch, a cup of cold coffee in hand, watching the horizon fade to orange. The sky over Santa Fe burned the way it always did before dusk. I thought about what Grandpa would have said if he'd been alive. Probably something simple like, let them chase what they're chasing. You keep your ground. A week passed before I heard from them again. A short message from Linda showed up in my inbox. Just wanted to check in. Hope you're doing well. We're still around. The kind of message that pretends not to ask for something. I didn't reply. 2 months later, a letter came from their attorney in Los Angeles, asking for a meeting about family estate concerns. I tossed it in the drawer and tried to forget it. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was coming. Something that would drag the past right back to my doorstep. One evening I found the old diary on the shelf. The one Grandpa used to write in. I hadn't opened it in years. The pages smelled like dust and ink. Near the back, I found a note written in his neat, careful handwriting. Some men never outgrow their envy. I stared at that line for a long time. The next morning, I walked out to the porch, the sun cutting sharp across the fields, and realized the peace I'd known for most of my life was over. The road from town stretched empty toward the horizon. But I knew they'd come back again. People like my parents always do when they think there's still something left to take. I picked up the chess piece from the table, turned it in my hand, and felt the weight of it. Grandpa used to say you can't play defense forever. At some point, you have to move. I didn't know it yet. But the next move would be theirs. And it would start a game I never wanted to play. It started with a phone call I didn't want to answer. I was halfway through writing a case brief when the screen lit up with a number I didn't recognize. Against my better judgment, I picked it up. A man's voice came through. Polite but rehearsed. Mr. Cole. This is Daniel Briggs, attorney for Robert and Linda Cole. We'd like to discuss the estate of the late Judge Samuel Cole. My grip on the phone tightened. I asked what exactly he wanted to discuss. He cleared his throat. There are questions about the legitimacy of your grandfather's will. My parents' lawyer. Of course. The silence between us stretched until he said, You'll be hearing from us formally soon. Then he hung up. 2 days later, the letter arrived. I didn't have to open it to know what it was. The heavy envelope with its neat black print might as well have said, We're coming for what's yours. Inside was the notice of intent to sue. The claim accused me of manipulating my grandfather during his final months, influencing him to change his will, and taking advantage of his fragile state. It read like fiction, but the signatures at the bottom were painfully real. I set the papers on the kitchen table and stared at them until the words blurred. My first reaction wasn't anger. It was exhaustion. I thought of Grandpa sitting in that same chair, steady and proud. The diary beside him. I whispered under my breath, I'm sorry you can't see this. Then I laughed once. Bitter and short. Maybe it was better he couldn't. The following week was chaos. News spreads fast in Santa Fe, especially when the name Cole is attached to it. Local headlines popped up online. Former judge's grandson, accused of inheritance fraud. Colleagues at the DA's office avoided eye contact. My supervisor, Allison Green, called me in. She shut the door behind me, her face careful, like she was handling glass. Ethan, she said, you're going to need to take a leave of absence while this plays out. I started to argue, but she raised a hand. You know the rules. Conflict of interest. Optics. I know you. I trust you. But the office can't be dragged into this. I nodded because she was right. Still, walking out of that building with a box of files felt like walking away from everything I'd built. At home, I called Henry Briggs, my grandfather's old friend and lawyer. He'd handled the estate after the funeral. When he picked up, his voice was warm, familiar. Ethan, I was expecting this call. Your father's been making noise around town. He wants a fight. And he's found a lawyer who likes noise. I asked what we could do. Henry sighed. Your grandfather's will was airtight. I drafted it myself, witnessed it, filed it. But when greed's involved, truth doesn't always stop people. We'll fight it, he said, calmly, like he'd done this dance before. That night I sat on the porch with a beer. The desert wind cold against my face. I could see the porch light reflecting off the empty fields. My father's words echoed in my head. You'll regret this. Maybe he'd planned this all along. Maybe he'd been waiting for the day Grandpa was gone. The lawsuit dragged me into a storm I didn't ask for. Reporters camped outside my office. Anonymous calls flooded my voicemail. The local gossip mill spun the story every way it could. Some people believed me. Most didn't. It's easier to believe a scandal than the truth. A few days later, I saw my father again. We crossed paths in front of the courthouse steps. He was wearing a charcoal suit, sunglasses, and that same smug smirk he used to wear when he thought he'd won an argument. He took off the glasses slowly, like we were in some kind of Western standoff. "You could still make this easy. Ethan," he said, "drop your claim. Sign over half. And we'll walk away." I looked at him. At the man who'd walked out of my life, and now stood there pretending we were equals. Grandpa's words echoed in my head. Justice isn't about winning. It's about protecting what's right. "You already took enough from this family," I said. "I'm not giving you the rest." His jaw tightened. "You think the court will side with you because you're some kind of hero." He leaned closer. "Don't forget, Ethan. You carry my name." I didn't flinch. "No," I said. "I carry his." Then I turned and walked away. When the case went public, my phone never stopped buzzing. Friends I hadn't heard from in years suddenly had opinions. Some offered help. Others advice I didn't ask for. A few quietly stopped answering my calls altogether. That's what happens when scandal touches your name. People scatter, afraid of catching it. Henry came over one evening, a folder under his arm. We sat in Grandpa's old living room. He flipped open the file, pulling out the diary. Its worn leather cover smooth from years of use. He placed it gently on the table. "Ethan, this may be our key. Your grandfather wrote about your father, about his behavior, his choices. It proves he knew exactly what he was doing when he left everything to you." I opened the diary, feeling the weight of every page. I read entries I'd never seen. One caught my eye. "Robert's greed breaks my heart. But I cannot change him. I only hope Ethan remembers what's right when I no longer can." My throat tightened. Henry nodded toward it. "That's your defense." His intent was clear. "Keep that safe." For weeks, I prepared for the hearing. I reviewed documents, statements, timelines, everything. I didn't have a legal team like my parents did. Just Henry and myself. But I had truth. The day of the preliminary hearing arrived, and Santa Fe's courthouse looked smaller than I remembered. Inside, the air felt heavy again. Same as before. My father's lawyer smiled at me across the aisle. All charm and arrogance. My parents sat beside him, perfectly composed. Like this was another performance for the cameras. Judge Graves entered, and the room went silent. He looked older, more tired than he had at the first hearing. But his voice carried the same authority. "Counsel, proceed." Their attorney started, painting me as an opportunist, a manipulative grandson who preyed on a dying man. I listened, unmoving. Then it was our turn. Henry stood, steady as a mountain, and began reading from the diary. The words filled the room, quiet but undeniable. When he finished, you could have heard a pin drop. Graves didn't say much. He simply nodded, eyes thoughtful, and said he'd review the material before setting a trial date. As everyone stood to leave, he looked at me. There was something in his expression I couldn't read. A mix of memory and respect. He said quietly, "Your grandfather was a good man." Then he turned to his clerk and left the bench. Outside, the sun was already setting, throwing long shadows across the courthouse steps. My parents walked past me without a word. My mother glanced back once, her face unreadable. My father didn't look at all. I stood there, watching them disappear into the parking lot, the desert wind tugging at my suit jacket. The fight had just begun. But I knew one thing for certain. They weren't after justice. They were after redemption they didn't deserve. And I wasn't going to give it to them. The first weeks after the hearing felt like living in slow motion. Every day started the same way. The smell of coffee, the hum of the refrigerator, the silence that sat in the house like an uninvited guest. I had learned to live alone years ago. But this silence was different. It wasn't peace anymore. It was waiting. Santa Fe had a way of holding on to gossip, and this lawsuit had given the town something new to chew on. The story of the prosecutor being sued by his own parents made its way into every coffee shop and grocery store. Some people looked at me with pity, others with quiet judgment. I got used to both. One morning, while I was reading through depositions at my kitchen table, I saw a headline flash on my phone. It was a piece from the Santa Fe Tribune, Judge Cole's grandson under investigation for will tampering. They even used a picture of me walking out of court, my face half-shadowed like a mugshot. Beneath it was a quote from my father saying he only wanted fairness and transparency. I laughed out loud, but there wasn't much humor in it. Later that day, Henry called. I could hear papers rustling on his end. "Ethan," he said, "they're trying to bury you under publicity. Your father's attorney is leaking selective information to make you look guilty. We can fight it, but it's going to get ugly." I told him I was already past ugly. He sighed. "The court date's been set. 3 weeks from now. Get ready." So I did. I read every line of my grandfather's will until I could recite it from memory. I organized every letter he ever sent me, every note from his diary. I even dug out old photographs, the ones showing me as a kid sitting on Grandpa's lap while he read from that same diary. Evidence, I told myself, though really, it was comfort. At night, sleep came in fragments. I kept dreaming of Grandpa sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames. In the dream, he never spoke, but I knew what he wanted to say. Stay steady. Stay true. 3 nights before the trial, I drove out to the ranch. The house was dark except for the porch light that had never gone out. I walked through the rooms, running my hand over the furniture, the walls. It felt smaller than it used to. I stopped at the old study. The chessboard still sat on the desk. I picked up the white knight and turned it over in my hand. "The same scuffed piece from my childhood," I whispered. "I'll protect this place, Grandpa, no matter what." The morning of the trial, Santa Fe woke up under gray skies. The courthouse was packed. Reporters lined along the steps, cameras flashing. Inside, the air was thick with murmurs. My parents sat at their table, perfect in posture, dressed like they were attending a fundraiser. My father looked straight ahead. My mother avoided my eyes entirely. Judge Graves entered, and the room went silent. He looked at both sides before speaking. "Let's keep this civil," he said. "The truth will speak for itself." Their attorney, Torres, went first. He stood confidently, voice calm and sharp. He painted a picture of manipulation, of a grandson who used his grandfather's failing health to influence him. He displayed charts of bank transactions, letters taken out of context, a video clip of my grandfather leaving a medical clinic looking frail. He made it sound like I had preyed on a dying man. When he finished, the room felt heavy. People shifted in their seats, whispering. I stared at the table, breathing slow. Then Henry stood up, his voice quiet but firm. The late Judge Cole was of sound mind until the end. I was his legal counsel for over 20 years. He was meticulous, deliberate, and clear. His will reflected his values, not manipulation. Henry handed the judge a document. "This is a certified letter from the clinic, confirming the late judge's mental state, weeks before signing the will. Clear cognition, no signs of impairment." Torres tried to object, but Graves waved him off. "Overruled. Proceed." Henry continued, opening the diary. He read aloud the same passage I'd seen before. "Grandpa's handwriting steady. Robert is my son, but he has lost himself to greed. I cannot trust him with what I've built. Ethan understands what justice means." The room fell silent. My mother's hands tightened around her purse strap. My father shifted uncomfortably, his jaw locked. I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes on the diary. Then came my turn on the stand. Torres asked question after question, trying to twist my words. He pointed to my bank statements, to my promotion at the DA's office, to every sign of success, saying it all came too easily. His tone dripped with accusation. I stayed calm, just like Grandpa taught me. When he finally paused, I said, "My grandfather didn't give me money. He gave me a moral compass. Everything I have, I earned." There was a murmur from the back of the courtroom. I caught Judge Graves watching me. His expression was unreadable, but something in his eyes said he remembered that boy from years ago, sitting beside Judge Cole in the old courthouse gallery. By the third day of the trial, things started to turn. Torres brought up a claim that my grandfather had been medicated for pain, implying he was mentally compromised. Henry countered immediately with medical records. The doctor's notes confirmed clarity. No cognitive impairment. Then came a surprise witness. A nurse who'd cared for my grandfather during his final weeks took the stand. She looked nervous but spoke clearly. Judge Cole was fully aware. She said, "He often talked about his grandson Ethan. Said he was proud. He even asked me once if I thought leaving everything to Ethan would cause trouble. I told him, not if truth wins." He smiled and said, "Then truth it is." When she stepped down, I felt something break loose inside me. Not relief exactly, but something close. During recess, I went outside for air. The wind was cold, sharp, and smelled like rain. I stood by the steps looking down at the street when I saw my father standing by the car. Phone to his ear. He glanced at me and ended the call. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then he said, "You think this ends here? You think a courtroom makes you better than me?" I answered quietly, "I don't need to be better. I just need to be right." He stared at me, his eyes burning with something between anger and regret. Then got into the car and drove away. Back inside, the rest of the day moved in a blur. Graves announced he would take a few days to review the evidence before giving his decision. The courtroom emptied slowly. Voices low, shoes echoing on the tile. When everyone was gone, I stood alone for a moment, staring at the judge's bench. The diary still in my hand. The same bench where my grandfather once sat decades ago, defending truth in that same calm tone. I whispered under my breath, "I did what you taught me." Then I walked out of the courtroom into the fading light. The sound of rain beginning to fall against the windows. The rain didn't stop that night. It came down steady, tapping against the windows, filling the air with that clean smell of wet earth. I sat at the kitchen table staring at the diary. The pages opened to the last thing my grandfather ever wrote. True justice isn't found in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who keep believing in it. I must have read that line 100 times, tracing the ink with my thumb until it smudged. 3 days passed before Judge Graves called for the verdict. Those days crawled by, every hour heavy with waiting. I tried to distract myself, went running, cleaned the house, cooked meals I didn't eat. Still, every time the wind hit the side of the house, it sounded like footsteps coming up the porch. I kept expecting something bad to happen before the decision came down. Some last trick from my father's lawyer. It came early Friday morning. I was pouring coffee when my phone buzzed. Henry's name flashed on the screen. I answered before the second ring. He didn't waste time. The judge ruled, "Ethan, we won." His voice was calm, steady, but I could hear the relief underneath. The court dismissed every claim. The will stands. For a moment I didn't say anything. I just stared at the wall, my mind blank. Then I let out a slow breath I'd been holding for months. "Thank you, Henry," I said quietly. He cleared his throat. "You don't owe me thanks. You earned this. Your grandfather would be proud." I hung up and sat there for a while, letting it sink in. The house was quiet except for the sound of rain easing off the roof. I thought of Grandpa sitting in this same kitchen years ago, his strong hands folded over a cup of coffee, telling me that truth always takes its time. Maybe he'd been right all along. When I finally walked outside, the air smelled fresh, the sky clearing. The world looked the same, but everything in me felt lighter. For the first time in months, I wasn't fighting anyone. The storm had passed, but peace never lasts long when family's involved. By the time I reached my truck, my phone was buzzing again, this time with messages from people I hadn't heard from in years. Reporters wanted statements. Colleagues wanted to know if I was coming back, and buried between them, one message stopped me cold. It was from Linda. Just 5 words. "You destroyed your own father." I didn't reply. There wasn't anything left to say. That afternoon, I drove into town. The courthouse parking lot was half empty, wet asphalt shining under the sun. When I walked inside, the receptionist nodded, told me Judge Graves was finishing a hearing. I waited outside the courtroom, When the door opened, he stepped out, robe slung over one arm. He noticed me and gave a small smile. "Mr. Cole," he said. "I'm glad to see you. Congratulations." His voice was formal, but there was something personal behind it. "Thank you, Your Honor," I said. "I appreciate your fairness." He nodded once, then hesitated. "I served alongside your grandfather for 10 years. He was one of the few judges who never forgot what justice was supposed to mean. You carry that same steadiness. Keep it. It's rare these days." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded. He gave me a firm handshake before walking down the hall. Outside the courthouse, reporters were waiting again. I ignored the microphones and walked straight to my truck. I could feel the heat of the sun soaking into the metal door handle. It felt like the world was finally moving forward. That evening, I drove back to the ranch. The drive felt different this time. The air clearer, the sky open. When I pulled into the gravel drive, the porch light flicked on automatically. Just like always. I went inside and set the diary back on the shelf beside Grandpa's law books. The house smelled like pine and old paper. I sat down on the couch and closed my eyes. For a few quiet hours, I almost believed it was over. But just before midnight, the phone rang again. This time it wasn't a reporter. It was a friend from town, Frank Delgado, a local contractor who'd grown up with me. He sounded uneasy. "Ethan, I think you should see this," he said. "Someone posted a video online. It's about your grandfather." I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. "What kind of video?" He hesitated. "Just look it up. It's everywhere." I opened my laptop, typed my grandfather's name, and there it was. A grainy clip of him in a hospital bed, looking frail. His voice barely a whisper. The caption read, "Proof Judge Cole wasn't in his right mind." The video had already spread across social media. The comments section was full of strangers debating whether I'd taken advantage of a dying man. I watched the whole thing. Every second of it. The footage was old, taken without permission. My father's voice could be heard faintly in the background, feeding him questions. Grandpa looked confused, dazed. And in the middle of it, he said something that twisted my gut. "Robert always means well. He just loses his way." Out of context, it sounded like forgiveness. In the hands of the internet, it looked like vindication for my father. I slammed the laptop shut. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, but anger. He wasn't done. Even after losing in court, my father was going to drag this through the mud. The next morning, the story was on every local channel. My phone buzzed nonstop again. Allison from the DA's office called, asking if I was holding up. I told her I was fine. It was a lie. Henry called later that afternoon. "I'm sorry, Ethan," he said. "This kind of smear doesn't hold legal weight, but it does damage. You might need to go quiet for a while. Let it burn out." I stared at the window, watching the clouds roll in again. He's not going to stop, Henry. Not until he gets what he wants. Henry was silent for a moment. Then he said, "Maybe it's not about what he wants. Maybe it's about what he's trying to fix in himself." I didn't respond. That night, I sat in the living room. The diary open again. The words swimming in the lamplight. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about understanding. Grandpa's handwriting was steady even in his last entry. I wondered if I could still believe that. I went outside and stood under the porch. The air cool. The stars sharp against the dark. The ranch was quiet, except for the sound of crickets. I could almost hear Grandpa's voice again, telling me to keep my balance, not to let anger take the lead. But I wasn't sure if I could do that anymore. Not after seeing my father use his memory like a weapon. The fight was supposed to be over. Instead, it had just changed shape. I stayed out there until the sky began to pale with morning light. My coffee cold in my hand, the diary heavy against my chest. I knew I'd have to face him again. Not in court this time, but somewhere far more personal. I drove into town before sunrise. The road slick from the night rain. The headlights carving through the mist that hung low over the hills. I didn't know exactly what I was planning to do. Part of me wanted to confront my father face to face, to ask him how he could drag Grandpa's memory through the mud just to win a fight that was already lost. Another part of me knew that nothing I said would change him. But silence felt worse. By the time I pulled into the parking lot outside his law office, the sun was just beginning to rise. He'd been renting space downtown since moving back from Los Angeles. His name was stenciled neatly on the frosted glass door, Robert Cole. Financial consultant. I stood there for a long moment, my reflection overlapping his name. Then I knocked. He opened the door wearing a crisp white shirt and that smug half-smile I remembered too well. "You're up early," he said. I didn't answer. I walked past him into the office. The place was clean, organized, and completely empty of warmth. There was a photo of him and my mother on a shelf, both of them smiling like a couple who hadn't destroyed anything. "You saw the video, didn't you?" he said finally. Leaning against the desk, I turned toward him. "Why did you do it? Haven't you done enough?" His expression didn't change. "The truth deserves to be seen. Ethan, people needed to know who your grandfather really was." I took a step closer. "He was dying," I said. "He trusted you enough to let you visit. And you recorded him without his consent. You used him." His eyes narrowed, the smooth confidence slipping for just a second. "You wouldn't understand," he said. "He wanted me to forgive him. That video proves it." "No," I said quietly. "It proves exactly what kind of man you've become." He crossed his arms, his voice turning sharp. "Don't talk to me like I'm the villain. Your grandfather wasn't perfect. He gave everything to you. Left nothing for me. Not even a chance to fix what he broke." He paused, his voice tightening. "I deserved more than a diary. You deserved what you earned," I said. "And you earned exactly that." The silence between us stretched thin. He looked away first, walking over to the window. "You think you've won because of that ruling? It's not over. Not for me. Not for your mother." "Then stop," I said. "Stop before you destroy what little you have left." He didn't answer. His reflection in the glass looked smaller than I remembered. Almost tired, I turned to leave, my hand on the door. When he spoke again, "You think Grandpa was proud of you? He wasn't. You just remind him of everything he lost with me." I didn't look back. I just said, "Maybe." But at least I gave him peace before he died. Outside, the morning air hit me like cold water. I stood by the truck for a moment, staring at my hands. They were shaking. Though I wasn't angry anymore, I was just tired. The kind of tired that sinks into your bones. When I got back to the ranch, I found a note taped to the front door. It was from Linda. Her handwriting was neat and controlled. "Stop hurting your father. He's trying to make things right. You're too blinded by resentment to see it." I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. The wind caught it and carried it across the porch. That night, I turned on the news out of habit. There it was again. The same footage of Grandpa, played over and over like a wound that wouldn't close. The reporter's voice said the clip had been re-examined by several local networks, sparking new debate about the Cole estate. My father's name was everywhere again. Some people called him a victim, others a disgrace. I turned off the TV and sat in the dark. A few days later, I got a call from Henry. "The judge wants to see you," he said. "It's about the case." My stomach dropped. I thought it was over. He didn't explain more, only said, "Come tomorrow morning." The next day I was back in the same courtroom that had swallowed so much of my life. It looked smaller now, quieter. Judge Graves sat at his bench, reading through a stack of papers. When he looked up, his eyes softened. "Mr. Cole, I called you in because I wanted to speak directly before closing the file." He stood and walked toward me, the gavel resting on the desk behind him. "I've seen a lot of families fight over money," he said. "But this case was different. It wasn't about the will. It was about legacy. Your grandfather was a man of principle. I know because I served with him." He paused. "He taught me what fairness meant. And I see that in you." I didn't know what to say. He smiled faintly, then continued. "I also saw the video. It doesn't change anything. The court's decision stands. The matter is closed." For a second, I thought I saw something in his eyes. Maybe pride. Maybe sadness. He extended his hand. "Take care of that ranch. And yourself." I shook his hand and left the courtroom. The hallway outside smelled faintly of old wood and disinfectant. My footsteps echoed down the corridor. As I reached the exit, I stopped and turned back for one last look at the door. Grandpa had walked these same halls once. The thought made my chest ache in a way I couldn't explain. Outside, the sun was high and hot, the wind carrying the dry scent of the desert. Reporters were waiting again. But this time, I didn't stop. I walked straight past them to my truck. The world around me blurred into motion. But for me, everything felt still. When I pulled into the ranch that evening, the light was fading. I parked the truck and sat for a long time. Engine off, listening to the sound of cicadas. For the first time in months, I felt the weight begin to lift. The law had spoken. Justice, for once, had sided with truth. I went inside and placed the diary on the table beside the chessboard. The room was warm with the glow of the setting sun. I could almost hear Grandpa's laugh, soft and knowing. Then my phone buzzed. I didn't recognize the number, but something in me knew who it was. I answered. "Ethan," the voice said. It was quiet, strained, and full of something I hadn't heard in years. It was my father. I read the diary again. He said. The words came slow, heavy. "I think I finally understand him." I didn't speak. He went on. "I saw what he wrote about me, about you. He was right. I was angry at the wrong man." The silence between us stretched, filled with all the years we'd lost. Then he said, "I'm not asking for forgiveness. I just wanted you to know, I'm sorry." My throat tightened. For a long time, I didn't say a word. Then I told him the truth. "Maybe one day, we'll find peace, Dad." When the call ended, I sat there listening to the dial tone fade, the last light slipping through the window. I picked up the diary, opened to the final page, and whispered, "You were right, Grandpa. Justice has a heartbeat." Outside, the wind rustled through the pines, and for the first time in years, the house didn't feel empty. It felt alive again, like it was breathing with me. The next few days passed quietly, the kind of quiet that felt earned. For the first time in years, I woke up without that heavy feeling pressing on my chest. The ranch looked different in the morning light, cleaner somehow, as if the dust had settled not just on the land, but on everything that had come before. I fed the horses, fixed a loose gate hinge, and let the silence stretch. Every sound, from the wind to the hum of the old refrigerator, felt like part of the rhythm of something healing. A week after that call, I went into town to pick up supplies. Santa Fe was small enough that you couldn't stay anonymous, especially after your name had been in the papers. I felt eyes on me the moment I walked into the hardware store. Some nodded politely, others whispered. I'd gotten used to that too. It didn't bother me anymore. Not really. On my way out, a woman stopped me near the register. She was older, maybe late 60s, wearing a sun hat and the kind of smile that could disarm anyone. "You're Judge Cole's grandson, aren't you?" she said. I nodded, half expecting something sharp to follow, but she just smiled wider. "Your grandfather was a good man. Helped my husband once when he got caught up in some land dispute years ago. Never charged a dime. I heard what happened. You did right by him, son." I thanked her and walked out into the sunlight, feeling something I hadn't in a long time. Pride, maybe, or relief. For years, the Cole name had been a shadow over me. That moment, it finally felt like mine again. But while the town started to move on, my parents didn't disappear. News trickled in through friends, through the same people who loved to gossip. My father's business had taken a hit after the trial. Clients dropped him. A few investors pulled out. One of his old associates said he'd been blacklisted from a local finance board after the scandal. My mother lost her segment on the regional news channel not long after. Officially, they said it was restructuring. Everyone knew better. Part of me should have felt satisfied, maybe even vindicated. But when I saw the photos online of them leaving a building surrounded by cameras, heads down, I didn't feel anything close to joy. Just a deep, hollow ache. Karma doesn't always look like victory. Sometimes it just looks like loss on both sides. One evening, I got a call from Allison at the DA's office. She asked if I was ready to come back. "We miss you around here," she said. We've got cases piling up, and a kid in your old unit who keeps quoting you like scripture." I laughed, surprised at how good it felt. "I'll be back Monday," I told her. It was time. Returning to work felt strange at first. People treated me differently, more carefully, like I might break. But the work steadied me. The first case I got was small. A vandalism charge involving a teenager who'd smashed the window of a corner store. When I met the kid, he looked terrified. Barely 17. Shaking in his seat. His file said he'd lost his mom the year before. Fallen in with the wrong crowd. I looked at him and saw a version of myself that could have existed if Grandpa hadn't taken me in. I talked to the judge. Argued for community service instead of jail time. The judge agreed. When the kid left, he turned back and whispered, "Thanks, man." I didn't know what else to do but nod. That night, I sat in my office long after everyone had gone home. The city lights glowed through the window, flickering like distant campfires. I opened the drawer where I'd kept Grandpa's diary. The leather now worn soft at the edges. I read one line at random. "Justice is how we teach mercy without forgetting truth." I thought about all the people I'd seen in court. Guilty and not. Broken and hopeful. I finally understood what he'd meant. A few weeks later, I drove out to the cemetery. It was late afternoon. The sun hanging low over the hills. The wind warm and dry. Grandpa's grave sat under a lone oak tree. The headstone simple. The words clean. Judge Samuel Cole, a man who served truth. Someone had left a small bouquet of sunflowers beside it. I smiled, knowing exactly who it had been. Mrs. Porter from town never forgot him. I stood there a while, talking to him like he was still listening. "You'd probably tell me I handled it wrong," I said softly. "I should have been more patient. Less angry, but I did what you taught me. I tried to protect what's right. I think you'd understand." The wind picked up then, carrying dust across the dry grass. I closed my eyes and let it pass over me. For the first time, I didn't feel alone. On my way back to the truck, my phone buzzed. It was a message from my father. Just 3 words. I read it again. "Thank you, son." I stood there, staring at it for a long time. I didn't know what he meant, or what he was thanking me for. Maybe for listening. Maybe for not hating him completely. I typed back, "Take care of yourself." Then I deleted it. Some words didn't need to be said. Back home, I poured a drink and sat by the porch, watching the last of the light fade. The desert air cooled, and the first stars started to appear. I thought about how far everything had come full circle, how Grandpa's lessons, his faith in justice and decency, had outlived him in ways I never expected. The phone rang again. This time, a different number. It was Frank Delgado, my friend from town. He told me he'd just seen my parents at the diner near Main Street. Said they looked different. Quieter. My father had lost weight. My mother barely spoke. They didn't look angry anymore. Just tired. I thanked him for letting me know but didn't ask for more. I didn't need to see it. That night I dreamed of the ranch the way it used to be. When Grandpa was still alive and the air smelled like hay and coffee, he was sitting on the porch, reading that same diary. His glasses low on his nose. He looked up and smiled. I woke up before he spoke, but I knew what he would have said. "Keep walking, Ethan. The road's long, but you're not alone." I opened my eyes to the soft glow of dawn breaking through the window. The house was quiet again, but it didn't feel empty. I stood, stretched, and poured a cup of coffee. Outside, the world looked clean, washed in gold light. Somewhere out there, I hoped my father had finally found the peace he'd been chasing all his life. I picked up the diary one last time, ran my fingers over the words, and whispered, "You were right, Grandpa. Justice isn't just the law. It's learning how to forgive without forgetting who you are." Then I closed the book and watched the sunrise spill across the horizon. Steady and quiet, like the start of something new. The sun kept climbing higher, turning the sky, that soft shade of blue that only shows up after a long night. I stood there watching it, coffee still warm in my hand, feeling the weight of everything I'd been through settle into something lighter. The ranch looked alive again. The horses were grazing. The wind was moving through the trees. And for the first time in years, the quiet didn't sound like loneliness. It sounded like home. That morning, I drove into town. The courthouse sat in the distance. The same building that had held so many memories, both good and bad. I wasn't there for a case or a fight this time. I was there to hand in my official paperwork to return to work. When I walked through those doors, the smell of old wood and paper hit me like a memory. Allison saw me first and smiled. "Look who decided to come back," she said. I grinned. Couldn't stay away forever. She handed me a folder. Same office. Same desk. "Just try not to make the news again." "All right." We both laughed. But her eyes softened. "I'm glad you're back. Ethan, you belong here." The first few weeks were quiet. I buried myself in work. Took small cases. Avoided anything that would drag my name through the spotlight again. Santa Fe was moving on. The whispers that once followed me were gone. People had found something new to talk about. As they always do. One afternoon, a new case landed on my desk. It was a custody dispute. Messy and painful. The kind that never had clean winners. A father fighting for the right to see his daughter after years of being absent. His name was different. But something about the story felt familiar. As I read through the file, I could almost hear my own father's voice. Full of excuses and regret, I sat back in my chair, the edges of the paper curling under my fingers. Later that day, I stood in front of the judge presenting the case. My argument wasn't about money or rights. It was about time. Time lost. Time wasted. Time that couldn't be bought back. I told the court that redemption shouldn't be handed out easily. But it shouldn't be impossible either. The man cried when the judge ruled in his favor. And for the first time in a long time, I understood what mercy looked like when it didn't come from guilt. That evening, I stopped by the small diner near the courthouse. The one where Grandpa used to take me after school. Frank was sitting in his usual booth, nursing a cup of black coffee. He waved me over. "You're starting to look like the old you again," he said. Maybe a little less pissed off. I smiled. "Guess I'm finally catching up to what Grandpa wanted for me." Frank leaned back, eyes thoughtful. That old man would have been proud. "You know, he'd probably tell you not to waste good air on people who don't deserve it." We laughed. And for a moment, the world felt normal again. A few days later, I found myself driving through the old part of town, past the park, past the church where we held Grandpa's funeral. Out of habit, I stopped by the small bookstore at the corner of Alameda Street. The owner, Mrs. Watkins, recognized me immediately. She'd been one of Grandpa's friends, too. She handed me a small brown package. "This was left here months ago," she said. "Your father dropped it off. Asked me to hold it for you." I took it home, hesitating before opening it. Inside was a single book wrapped in tissue paper. It was Grandpa's diary. The same one I'd given to my father the day the trial ended. There was a note tucked inside. I finally read it all. "Ethan. Every page. I think I understand him now. I hope someday you'll understand me too." I closed the book and sat there for a while. The house quiet, except for the ticking of the old clock on the wall. I didn't cry. I didn't even feel angry. Maybe forgiveness didn't come all at once. Maybe it just crept in slowly, like the dawn after a long night. As weeks turned into months, the ranch became my refuge again. On weekends, I'd drive out there to fix small things or just walk the property. The land had a way of grounding me, reminding me that some things survive no matter how much life tries to break them. I planted new sunflowers along the fence line, the same way Grandma used to. Every morning, I'd watch them turn toward the light. And every time they did, I thought about how simple it could be to keep going if you just faced the right direction. One evening, as the sun began to set, I stood by the fence, looking out across the field. I pulled the diary from my jacket pocket, opened to the last page, and read Grandpa's handwriting again. True justice isn't found in the courtroom, but in the hearts of those who keep believing in it. I smiled, tracing the words one last time. He was right. He always was. A car pulled up behind me. It was Allison. She stepped out, her hair catching the orange light of the sunset. "I figured I'd find you here," she said. "I thought maybe you'd want company." She handed me a bottle of water and leaned against the fence beside me. Quiet out here. Peaceful. Yeah, I said. It's the kind of quiet that doesn't ask for anything. We stood there for a while, watching the sky shift from gold to pink. She looked at me, her voice soft. So, what now? I smiled. Now I live. I keep doing what he taught me. Protect what's right. Forgive what I can. And let the rest go. She nodded. And we fell back into silence. The crickets started up again, filling the air with that familiar rhythm. I looked out at the horizon, the ranch bathed in fading light. And I felt something settle inside me. Not closure exactly, but peace. The kind you don't fight for. The kind you just accept. Before the night fully set in, I walked back toward the house, the diary still in my hand. On the porch, I turned back once more. The stars beginning to appear above the fields. Life had come full circle. In the quietest, simplest way possible. I sat down, opened the book again, and whispered the same words Grandpa used to say when he taught me chess as a boy. Play fair. Think ahead. And always leave the board better than you found it. If you've stayed with me through this story, maybe that's the part you were meant to hear. Life isn't about the wins or the losses. It's about what you choose to protect when the game gets hard. So tell me, what would you protect? If it were your move next.